In this video, we complete our journey along the Chicago Great Western Route from Chicago to Oelwein, Iowa, having visited all of the disused stations along the way. This time, we continue our investigation into the former station site, railroad shops, and massive hub located in Oelwein, Iowa, from the city's boom period to the present day, and also including a visit to Oelwein's Hub City Railroad Museum, with its extensive collection of artifacts, photographs, and equipment.
In our previous video, we last left off discussing the Chicago Great Western Station and Shops at Oelwein, as well as the early history of the host city, concluding at the height of Oelwein's boom years, circa 1910. Recall that Stickney's vaunted railroad had faltered in 1907, weakened by a general labor strike, going into receivership in early 1908, subsequent to the U.S. economy succumbing to the Panic of 1907.
Starting in 1909, under the new leadership of Samuel Morse Felton, the Chicago Great Western regained its footing. Infused with new capital, the railroad once again turned its attention to much-needed improvements. In 1912, Oelwein obtained its long-awaited new passenger depot, one of the finest in the CGW network. By this time, nearly 1,200 men worked in the shops, roundhouse, and yards, not including train crews. A few shop and yard upgrades occurred at about this time, with upgrades to the powerhouse, a significant expansion of the blacksmith shop, and a tin and plumbing shop, also known as the mallet shop, added to the south side of the massive machine shop building. In 1915, another enhancement included the construction of the iconic steel pedestrian bridge over the rail area, which enabled workers to more safely and easily get to and from the shops from the east side of town. A modest extension was added to the depot kitchen in 1916.
The Chicago Great Western was improving its operating equipment as well. One notable experiment was the purchase of 10 Baldwin-built mallet-type engines, which could pull an astounding 4,000 tons of train, almost 3 times the weight pulled by other locomotives, which the railroad hoped to use on some of its more challenging segments, such as the Stockton to Oelwein route. However, these engines proved to have some serious deficiencies, as they were found to be slow, very hard on the train tracks, and expensive to maintain. In fact, they were so outsized that a special shop was built to service them at Oelwein in 1911. Instead, the Chicago Great Western disposed of these engines within a few years' time and focused on the powerful Mikado-type engines, 282s, as being the workhorse for their fleet.
In 1916, the Chicago Great Western, as well as all railroads within the U.S., faced another major labor dispute when in August of that year, as Alpheus Bede Stickney lay on his deathbed, the various brotherhoods of engineers, firemen, and conductors voted to go on strike. At issue was the length of the workday, often extending to 16 hours, a long work week, often requiring 6 to 7 days, the low pay, and sometimes unsafe working conditions. Railroad companies refused to give in to their demands, and so a national strike was called by the leaders of the organized labor unions. As railroad transportation was utterly vital to the U.S. economy, and since the U.S. was considering entering into the Great War overseas, the federal government, then led by President Woodrow Wilson, decided to intervene.
Wilson formed a National Labor Mediation Board, which was tasked with resolving disputes between workers and employers. Over the course of weeks, the board helped mediate a compromise that resulted in some, but not all, of the workers' demands being met, including higher pay, better working conditions, and some better scheduling of work hours. The 1916 strike contributed to the broader movement for labor rights in the United States. In 1917, triggered by the averted 1916 strike, the Adamson Act was passed, which established the 8-hour workday for railroad workers, considered to be a major win for their unions.
The Great Depression that struck the world economy in the late 1920s into the early 1930s deeply affected the Chicago Great Western labor force, including employees at Oelwein. Train traffic was seriously reduced, especially passenger traffic, and it was at about this time when many of the well-liked passenger trains were eliminated from the timetables, such as the Legionnaire, the Redbird, and the Bluebird. Railroad workers generally kept their jobs through this interval, but their shifts and work hours were drastically slashed, deeply affecting their incomes. Most, however, were happy to have retained their jobs, given the alternatives that many faced. Within a few years, the Chicago Great Western, as a result of a significantly depressed economy, as well as the financial mismanagement of the Patrick Joyce administration, once again went into receivership, this time in early 1935.
Train traffic continued to decline in the late 1930s, with the rise of automotive transport for both personal and commercial needs. Bitterly cold winters, as well as crop failures in the U.S. Midwest, also hit the company's bottom line, as grain shipments fell sharply in the mid-1930s. Jobs and workers slowly trickled away from Oelwein. Nonetheless, the Chicago Great Western finally came out of receivership in early 1941, reorganized but largely intact, and retaining its long-held name.
The onset of World War II reignited the transport and rail industries, as the nation's economy kicked into high gear to support the war effort. The Chicago Great Western and Oelwein suddenly found itself in the midst of a labor shortage, as many young men were called to duty in the war, and since much of the labor attrition since the Great Depression had not been backfilled. The Oelwein shop and rail yards could not hire men fast enough to support the revitalized railroad center. This upsurge continued through the close of the war.
The imprint of the Oelwein rail yard on the Iowa landscape was extensive at this time, reaching from Frederick Avenue to the south to 45th Street to the north, more than 1.5 miles in length and 1,200 feet at the widest. 36 freight trains streamed in and out of Oelwein every day, as well as 28 passenger trains. The railroad employed well over 1,000 men at the shops and roundhouse, with a monthly payroll of more than $250,000.
As World War II came to a close in 1945, the U.S. economy, turbocharged from the war economy, saw spiraling inflation. Railroad workers, as well as workers in many other industries, felt the pinch. A general railroad strike, led by railroad brotherhoods and unions, was called in late May of 1946, with on the order of 250,000 railroad workers going on strike, causing widespread disruptions to rail services and transportation. The workers demanded higher wages, better working conditions, and more time for rest between shifts. President Harry S. Truman quickly intervened, threatening to take over the railroads. The walkout soon ended, and trains were running again. The unions begrudgingly accepted a compromise deal.
The Oelwein shops, originally built in the heyday of steam, by now had accumulated the mileage and soot of 50 years of heavy use, and were looking worn and long in the tooth. The Chicago Great Western, meanwhile, sought to streamline for more efficient operations, including a reduction in their substantial labor costs.
Throughout this interval, the Chicago Great Western continued to be innovative, in a constant quest for efficiency. The railroad was among the first to experiment with and use gasoline-powered engines for short-haul commuter trains at various places in their railroad network. They were among the first to use larger engines, such as the Texas 210-4s, for hauling longer and longer freight trains for efficiency. They pioneered the use of truck trailers or piggybacks on flat cars for more seamless movement of freight between trucks and trains in the 1930s. And they were quick to adapt to the use of diesel engines for train locomotives. switching over to this technology in the late 1940s. And it was dieselization in particular which spurred the next set of changes to the Oelwein Railyard and station area.
In the mid-1940s, the railroad began experimenting with diesel engines, purchasing 3 diesel 1,000 horsepower locomotives as switcher engines for their extensive rail yards. They were impressed enough to purchase another 6 4,500 horsepower diesel locomotives a short time later, replacing their larger Texas locomotives. And by 1948, CGW management officially announced the transition from steam to diesel power over the span of a few years. They also announced plans to build a new diesel shop at Oelwein, within the warren of existing shops on the west side of the tracks, breaking ground in May of 1948.
This was to be a 228-foot by 48-foot brick building, running north and south, parallel with the tracks, and situated to the south of the wheelhouse, taking out the easternmost portion of the machine shop building. There would be 2 pits for locomotive servicing and repair on the ground floor, with an office, storeroom, and workshop on the second floor. The building would be heated by 14 oil-burning heaters. The new shop was completed by October of 1949 at a total cost of $170,000, or about $1.3 million in today's money.
This, of course, would have a profound impact on the Oelwein workforce, that heretofore had spent decades, their entire careers, working on steam engine locomotive trains. And there were growing concerns regarding job security, as the Chicago Great Western had previously laid off hundreds of workers, in small increments, over the course of a few years. As the new diesel shop went up, about 50 men received diesel training in preparation for the new diesel repair shops, and they were servicing diesel engines shortly after the new facility opened its doors in late 1949. The changeover to diesel fuel also necessitated the storage of large amounts of reserve fuel at Oelwein, and so 3 huge storage tanks, each holding 1 million gallons of fuel, were installed in the fields to the north of the shops.
The change to diesel power coincided with new management of the Chicago Great Western in 1948, as the CGW was taken over by a Kansas City-based investment group, with coal magnate Grant Stauffer being named as the new company president. Behind the scenes was an assistant to Stauffer, the young executive William N. Deramus, only 33 years old, who managed the day-to-day operations, as Stauffer himself had little railroading knowledge and suffered from poor health. Perhaps the original plan was to groom the young Deramus under the more mature business executive over the course of a few years, but plans changed when Stauffer died in March of 1949, necessitating the early elevation of the young Deramus to lead the Chicago Great Western in post-war America. He was the youngest Class I railroad president in the United States.
As the company switched to diesel locomotives, the great roundhouse that dominated the northwest of the rail yard became obsolete. Instead, the railroad negotiated with the city of Oelwein and the Midland Warehouse Corporation to lease the large facility out as a warehouse. Other noteworthy changes were also occurring in the mid-1940s. In 1945, the iconic pedestrian bridge that loomed over the tracks for more than 30 years was torn down and replaced with an 8-foot by 8-foot concrete tunnel that passed east to west 14 feet below the tracks.
The young Deramus quickly completed the transition of the railroad to diesel. He then set about on an ambitious program to modernize the railroad infrastructure, with extensive reballasting of trackage across the network, replacing lighter rails with heavier gauge, and installing radio communications on trains so as to enable train crews to communicate with dispatchers and yardmasters while on the move.
At Oelwein, in addition to the new diesel shop, the Chicago Great Western launched a sweeping new building program to modernize the aging facility, thereby signaling their intention for Oelwein to continue as the center of the railroad's operations. In 1950, construction was started on multiple new structures at Oelwein. A spacious new yard office was constructed a few hundred feet south of the passenger depot, replacing the worn-out wooden building across from the old roundhouse. This was a two-story brick building, with the yard office on the main floor and the Central Service Bureau occupying the second floor. The yard office was used for crew calling, along with crews receiving their orders for their trains.
Just to the south of the yard office was erected a new yardmaster's tower, made with open steel framing, 75 feet tall, complete with heated windows, pneumatic tube communication for written orders, radio communications with the train crews and yard office, and a PA system for communications with the yard crews. High on this new perch, the yardmaster could direct activities in the yard below, such as the creation of trains.
A modern brick ice house was built just to the southeast of the old roundhouse. In it, more than 700 300-pound blocks of ice could be frozen at one time, then moved along the dock and conveyor into awaiting freight train cars, keeping produce fresh for long journeys across country. A new freight house, too, was also built, just to the south and west of the new ice house. By the end of 1951, almost all of these improvements were in place and operational.
Next up was a move to improve administrative and organizational efficiency by consolidating the corporate headquarters of the Chicago Great Western in one place, alongside the operational center of the railroad, in Oelwein. In 1952, office personnel, including the president's office and accounting offices, were moved into Oelwein primarily from their former seats of power, from Chicago, St. Paul, and Minneapolis. A new office building was being constructed to the west of the tracks and south of the machine shop by reusing and renovating the former clubhouse, where the campus hall and library were once located, creating more than 8,000 square feet of office space, and a place to house and operate their most expensive and sophisticated equipment, their IBM machines and teletypes. By the end of 1952, the corporate offices had been successfully moved, including all personnel.
This must have undoubtedly been culture shock for many of the office staff, to move from their big city atmosphere to the much more laid-back ambiance of Oelwein. To ease the transition, new subdivisions sprung up on the east side of Oelwein, at 9th Avenue Southeast, on the south side of Highway 3, employing curved streets and circular drives, something more akin to what some of the transferred employees enjoyed in their suburban homes.
While the corporate offices were being constructed, the 1912 depot was extensively remodeled to serve as both a passenger depot as well as provide additional corporate offices. The effective footprint of the building was unchanged, but the walls were rebuilt with concrete blocks, with a brick facing made up of recycled bricks from the 1912 depot. The old clay tile hip roof was replaced with a modern flat roof, which was fashionable at that time. The interior was completely gutted and modified, with offices situated on the east side and a passenger waiting room constructed on the west side along the tracks. The offices would be occupied by the general manager and superintendents.
In 1953, a new car shop and storage facilities used for the repair and rehabilitation of train cars was built just to the north of the old roundhouse. At the same time, the Chicago Great Western announced official rollout of piggyback service to transport semi-truck trailers atop specialized flatbeds. This method enabled seamless transfer of cargo from trucks to trains and vice versa. Things were generally looking up for both the railroad and Oelwein. A new energy pervaded the sprawling railroad campus, despite the gradual loss of hundreds of jobs in the 1940s due to layoffs.
However, within a few years, feeling the continued pressure from the automotive freight industry and reduced freight traffic, the railroad again began to falter. In November of 1954, more than 100 workers were laid off at the Oelwein shops, split between the car department and diesel shops, and thus began a period where the 500 or so Oelwein Railroad workers lived with some uncertainty, sometimes called back and sometimes laid off for significant periods of time, as the CGW's fortunes ebbed and flowed.
In January of 1960, a great fire destroyed the car shop that had been built just 7 years prior, when a gasoline engine blew up during testing. Due to lack of nearby fire hydrants, much of the building was destroyed, with losses estimated at $200,000. The car shop only employed 6 men at this time, and fortunately, none of them were seriously injured in the explosion and blaze.
Under continued pressure from automotive shipping, U.S. railroads found that the only way forward was to either merge and consolidate or go out of business. The Chicago Great Western attempted merger talks with the Rock Island Line, the Sioux Line, and the Frisco Line in 1963, but these negotiations soon fell apart. In 1964, the Chicago Great Western began negotiations with the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, one of their larger competitors, and hammered out an agreement late in the year. However, the Interstate Commerce Commission initially balked at this union, largely due to concerns from the CGW's and C&NW's competitors. However, within a few years, the merger was finally approved, with the Chicago and Northwestern taking over as the senior partner by mid-1968. As there was much overlap between the rail carriers' routes, the Chicago and Northwestern decommissioned most of the Chicago Great Western's routes, taking them out of service by the early 1970s. Shortly after the merger, most of Oelwein's office workers left Oelwein, as their job functions had either been deemed redundant or were to be taken up elsewhere.
But the Oelwein shops were to see a small renaissance. The Chicago and Northwestern made the decision to consolidate a portion of their diesel engine servicing work at the relatively new facilities at Oelwein. By the late 1960s, at the end of the road for the Chicago Great Western, the shops had reduced to less than 40 employees. But following the merger, rapidly grew to well over 100 workers by the early 1970s. The revitalized railroad works, organized as a system shop and a running repair shop, were pushing out 30 to 60 rebuilt diesel engines per year, making good use of the 1948 diesel shop and the vast expanse of the 1898 machine shop. The rebuilding of these diesel engines made good economic sense for the railroad, as new diesel engines cost upwards of $300,000, while a rebuilt engine cost them less than $100,000.
Times were good at the Oelwein shops for a period. It was nothing like the heady days of the early 1900s, but the shops now gave steady employment to a few hundred skilled workers with good wages. A generation of workers gave their blood and sweat to the enterprise, with a sense of great pride in the quality of their work, raising their families from the wages tendered. Alas, it was not to last. As the Chicago and Northwestern's own finances began to teeter due to deregulation and competition from automotive truck and air transportation, the 1980s and 1990s were marked by company restructuring and consolidation. Employment eroded at the Oelwein shops, now numbering at some 60 men. Rumors of acquisition by other railroads, such as the Union Pacific, circulated.
In February of 1993, as the Chicago and Northwestern management fended off rumors of acquisitions and closure of the Oelwein shops, the ellipsis of huge diesel fuel tanks that punctuated the north flank of the shop area for nearly 45 years was drained, dismantled, and removed. Months later, in August, Oelwein shop workers were notified that their 60-odd jobs were going elsewhere, to Marshalltown, Iowa, and other locations. Their choice was to either move with the job or to be laid off. By the spring of the following year, in 1994, the Oelwein shops including the vast open hall, the machine shop, the forge of Stickney's enterprise, a remnant of the Gilded Age, had been cleared of men, machinery, and materials. A public auction for the shop's remaining furniture and machinery was held that July. A handful of men were retained to close the facility down and turn off the lights.
The official end and closure of the Oelwein shops came in 1995, at about the same time as the Union Pacific Railroad's official acquisition of the Chicago and Northwestern. For the next several years, the shop building stood empty and abandoned, a distant echo of the bustling place that it once was. The provider of prosperity for so many families who saw their start in Oelwein. More than 110 years after their celebrated construction, the Oelwein shops were taken down and demolished in late 2011 and early 2012. For those who had spent much of their lifetime in the precinct of the shops or working within its walls, the closure of the Chicago Great Western's facilities and subsequent demolition would have been a deep, unsettling psychological blow, not easily reconciled or forgotten.
Remarkably, a few of the shops yet stand in the Oelwein shopyard, at the west end of the property. These being the buildings that anchored the west end of the shops to the north of the machine shop, the original car paint shop, and the blacksmith shop. They stand alone in a deserted field, hidden by small trees and bracken. These buildings are today owned by the Hub City Storage Company. Given their legacy, we dearly hope that these do not meet the same fate as the other shop buildings and are preserved in some fashion. The west end of these buildings is perhaps the last remaining vestige of the graceful Gilded Age industrial architecture that once dominated the Oelwein yards.
Falling into disuse by the 1970s, the relatively new ice house, built to the southeast of the roundhouse in the early 1950s, was razed in the mid-1990s. Its smaller sibling to the west, the 1950s freight house, was also taken down. Remarkably, the celebrated 1906 roundhouse, once one of the crown jewels of the Oelwein Railyard, still survives, although it has lost a few of its stones. The mounts have been significantly altered, and the large turntable has been removed. Behind its more modern trimmings, the old facility is only barely recognizable today. Now owned by Transco, it continues to serve as railway shop storage facility, approaching 120 years of age. Another rail yard icon, the old water tower, which stood just to the south of the 1906 roundhouse, becoming something of a safety hazard in recent years, was taken down by Transco in December of 2023.
The east portal of the concrete underground tunnel yet stands to the east of the tracks, a few hundred feet south of the former depot and Railyard buildings. The west end of this tunnel appears to have been filled in some time ago. Perhaps the most enduring landmark of Oelwein's railroad heritage that survives to the present is the extensive rail yard, reaching more than a mile in length from Charles Street to the south to 45th Street to the north, and consisting of 29 tracks and 29 switches. Here, trains and train cars continue to gleam in the morning sun, with the occasional movement and jostling of trains amidst the sinuous passage. The rail yard is owned by Transco Railway Products, which utilizes the yard for managing the various railroad cars that come in for servicing and repair.
Like the roundhouse and rail yard, Transco too can be considered one of Oelwein's great railroad survivors, the remaining descendant of its proud shop's legacy. Born out of the closure of the Chicago Great Western car shops when they were acquired by the Chicago and Northwestern in the late 1960s, the small company has continued to grow over the past 5 decades, specializing in the servicing and repair of railroad freight and tanker cars. For decades, the company has been one of Oelwein's major employers, employing well over 100 personnel at its Oelwein location. In fact, they've been so successful that they were recently acquired by Marmon, a Berkshire Hathaway company, in 2019.
By 1920, the budding city of Oelwein had reached a population of more than 7,700 residents. Triggered by growth, new buildings and infrastructure popped up across town in the ensuing decade. A new senior high school was built in 1924 at the southeast corner of East Charles Street and 3rd Avenue Southeast. A Masonic temple was built on the east side of Frederick Avenue, between 1st and 2nd Streets East. Mercy Hospital was dedicated in 1926, located on the east side of town, at 2nd Street Southeast and 8th Avenue Southeast. The Coliseum opened its doors in March of 1928 as a new entertainment venue, offering a ballroom, dances, and roller skating, with live music from orchestras and bands. A new public library was constructed the following year in 1929, and a new post office became a landmark on the north side of town, opening its doors in 1932.
Like most Iowa cities and towns, Oelwein loved baseball, and they had a local team to support, the Chicago Great Western baseball team, sometimes the Oelwein Athletics, a semi-pro club that played teams from other towns and cities in east and central Iowa, from the 1910s through the early 1930s. They would often draw local crowds of several hundred, and played at the Oelwein Baseball Park, a mile or so south of town, just north of the city park.
The Great Depression hit Oelwein as much as any town within the U.S. Midwest, but most could find some work, even if part-time, to keep things going through these difficult years. As the economy slowly improved, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a train stop in Oelwein at the Chicago Great Western Depot as part of his 1936 presidential campaign swing through the upper Midwest. Here, a large crowd of 7,000, almost the entire population of Oelwein, gathered to greet the president on October 9th in a light drizzle of rain. From the rear of the train, Roosevelt gave a brief 5 to 10 minute speech, buoyed by enthusiastic clapping and cheering from the crowd. A bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums was presented to his wife, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who stood by the president's side. After a final round of cheers and applause, President Roosevelt smiled and acknowledged the affectionate crowd as the presidential train pulled out of the station northward toward St. Paul.
In the 1940s and 1950s, as Chicago Great Western employment roller coastered, Oelwein city leaders realized the need to foster a more diversified economic portfolio of businesses, less dependent upon the railroad that stimulated their early growth. Following World War II, the community added businesses such as the Keniston Brothers Packing House, a new Levin ready-mix concrete plant, the Oelwein Chemical Company, and the Iowa Portable Mill Plant, as well as new retail stores such as J.C. Penney. Not resting on their laurels, the city organized the Oelwein Industrial Development Commission in 1958, purchasing land to create an industrial park to lure in new industry. The city's population now peaked at nearly 8,300 people in the 1960 U.S. Census.
Even with the recent economic diversification, the rumors of the Chicago Great Western's potential mergers triggered concern across the community, as the CGW was yet the major employer in the city, and a merger could mean the loss of a few hundred jobs or more. As the impending merger with the Chicago and Northwestern became more palpable in early 1968, the community was beset with another serious blow when a deadly tornado ripped through the heart of the city during the late afternoon of May 15th, killing one person, injuring dozens more, and seriously damaging hundreds of homes and businesses, including the Central School and the City Hall. It was estimated that 90% of Oelwein's downtown businesses suffered damage from the storm that devastated much of northeastern Iowa.
Within a year, in 1969, the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, perhaps as a gesture of goodwill, and perhaps knowing that the building would no longer be needed, deeded over the Oelwein Passenger Depot building, which had been rebuilt more than 15 years earlier, to the city of Oelwein. The building would become Oelwein's new city hall, as the original city administrative center had been badly damaged by the tornado. This was something of a parting gift, as what was unsaid in this transaction was that the Chicago and Northwestern no longer needed the office, accounting, and administrative jobs in Oelwein, and many of its freight handling jobs would be moved as well.
The double blow of the Twister-related calamity, followed by the loss of the city's major employer within months of one another, would have been very difficult for any community to endure. But through it all, Oelwein has survived and even thrived in many ways. Although it has lost almost 30% of its peak population from 1960, like previous generations, Oelwein city leaders continue to proactively shape the city's future for growth, seeking to attract new businesses for investment, job creation, and long-term viability. Over the decades, Oelwein has expanded its commercial base in manufacturing, healthcare, and the services industry, with major employers being East Penn Manufacturing, Mercy One Healthcare, Ashley Industrial Molding, Grandview Healthcare and Rehab, Transco Railway Products, and Birch Cabinet Manufacturing. The new Oelwein Public Library, built in 2006 at a cost of $3 million on the northeast side of town, funded mostly by government grants, gifts, and donations from community members, is a symbol of Oelwein's undaunted resolve and optimism for the future.
Today, Oelwein boasts two museums devoted to the history and legacy of the community and its railroads. The Oelwein Area Historical Society Museum, located at 900 2nd Avenue Southeast, contains more than 200 exhibits describing Oelwein's history through the decades, featuring industry, domestic life, farming, fashions, and railroads. The second museum, more on point with the subject of this video, is the Hub City Heritage Corporation Railway Museum, located on the grounds of the former Chicago Great Western Rail Yard, consisting of three structures: the former Express Freight Building, the former Rail Yard Office, and the 75-foot-tall Yardmaster's Tower, directly south of the Oelwein City Hall, the former Chicago Great Western Depot, as well as a yard area to the west of the buildings, containing several exterior exhibits. This museum was established in 1987 to foster an appreciation for the vital role that railroads, especially the Chicago Great Western, the Rock Island Line, and the Chicago and Northwestern, played in the shaping of Oelwein's history.
As this museum has so much to see, a complete tour would be a rather extensive video unto itself. And so instead, we will give you a quick tour of the treasures and artifacts that can be found here. But we would encourage any serious railroad researcher or thoughtful rail fan to make the pilgrimage to Oelwein, to spend a day or more exploring the rich set of exhibits this museum and city has to offer.
We begin our tour with a walk through the former Freight Express building, a portion of it being well over 100 years old. Here are housed some of the larger rail yard and station artifacts, such as luggage carts and trailers, handcars, railroad signs, yard tools, a large collection of electrical insulators, historic photos, signal lights, books, ticket office furniture, and control equipment.
From here we move to the former Yard Office Building, circa 1951, which is the heart of the Railroad Museum. Entering into the main room on the first floor of this building, we see a large model of the machine shop building that stood across the tracks to the southeast. An impressive model train layout also occupies a significant portion of the room, something for both model railroaders as well as the younger railroad fans. Here, too, we see the original crew assignment board, yet fastened to the wall, surviving from the 1950s, used by dispatchers in assembling crews for trains pending departure from the station, each crew member having their name on a small block of wood.
We next pass through a hallway to another large display room where shop signs are featured. The main exhibit room is chock full of historic yard maps, hundreds of historic photographs, Union banners, railroad artifacts of various types, train crew artifacts, yard crew artifacts, trainmen attire,
People and their families come across things and they don't even know what it is.
telegraph and radio communications equipment,
Very familiar with these old.
railroad signage, and notice boards. You could easily spend a few hours in this room alone. Many more photographs and documents are kept by the museum in a highly secure archival area, which is available by appointment.
Next, we ascend to the second floor museum rooms. The first room we enter features dozens of handcrafted locomotive models, created by former Chicago Great Western machinist George Whalen. Crafted with remarkable precision and incredibly entirely from walnut shells, these models highlight the passion and creativity of former CGW employees, such as George. Amidst these displays are toolboxes and kits, machine shop memorabilia, and an extraordinary collection of Chicago Great Western Railroad passes. An assortment of Chicago Great Western timetables and rule books, as well as a collection of the very rare Maze periodicals published by the Chicago Great Western during the first part of the 20th century.
Also on this floor are a few rooms dedicated to yet another local industry, waste management. These one-of-a-kind exhibits feature historical materials related to the history of garbage removal and recycling, containing a comprehensive library, including truck designs, schematics, and manuals. Museum board member Anthony Riccio shares his expertise and passion for the topic with museum visitors.
From the second floor of this building, we ascend the precarious steel steps of the tower into the yardmaster's roost. There are actually two upper stories within the tall structure. The lower story included a bathroom for the yardmaster and crew. And the upper story being where all the yard mastering took place. From this 75-foot high perch, the yardmaster would communicate with the yard office via pneumatic tubes, with trains via radio communications, and to the yard far below using a PA system. This upper loft features windows on all sides for 360-degree visibility. Just outside the windows, a catwalk gives the visitor an even better vantage point, giving incredible views of the rail yard, the former machine shop area, and the city of Oelwein. We, of course, would not recommend this catwalk for acrophobics.
Outside, in the museum's rail yard, there are more than a dozen railroad cars and engines, with some of them being must-see pieces of historic railroad equipment, especially a 1951 Chicago Great Western EMD FP7 1500 horsepower diesel engine, a 1914 Rock Island wooden caboose, a 1960 Chicago Great Western caboose, and a 1940 Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha SW1 engine. We will explore a few of these further. But first, Ed Ray, a railroad engineer and president of the Oelwein Railroad Museum, gives us a quick tour of the Chicago Great Western boxcar. Inside of this freight car are housed dozens of railroad artifacts, a mini museum unto itself. This collection is a substantial assemblage of signal lights, signaling systems and relays, and communications test equipment. Next, we get a quick glimpse of the interior of the Chicago Great Western caboose, rebuilt in the 1980s. This car, where the rear brakeman and conductor would repose during their off time, includes a cast iron stove, an ice box, and a few other amenities to ease their long shifts and journeys cross country. Finally, we get a detailed tour of the museum's greatest prize, their working 1951 FP7 diesel engine, rebuilt in 1974 at the Oelwein Shops and restored about 9 years ago by the museum. We enter through the rear of the engine, making our way past the massive 1,500 horsepower 16-cylinder diesel engine, which generates raw mechanical power that is converted to electricity, which then drives electric traction motors. We enter the cab area with 3 seats for the brakeman, fireman, and the engineer in the rightmost seat. In front of the engineer was the control stand, where the throttle and air brake controls were found. In the cubby to the fore of the locomotive was access for air brake servicing. Behind the seating area were control panels for the locomotive's electrical system. And finally, as we gaze out the front windows at the nose of the train, we get a glimpse of the historic view that Chicago Great Western engineers once took in as they traversed America's heartland.
This has been a truly remarkable journey, one that will not easily be forgotten, where we touched the relics of a fading American enterprise, made the acquaintance of extraordinary and resilient people, and witnessed the tenacious thread of history that still connects these railroad communities. A big shout-out to the people of Oelwein, the city leaders, the museum staff, restaurant and business owners, who all welcomed us with open arms during our multiple visits. There is more work to be done with this series. At a minimum, we will explore the DeKalb Spur, as well as one or more chapters revisiting artifacts that we missed on our first go-around, based on new information sent to us by viewers. Many thanks to our loyal Be Historic channel community, and to our Patreon subscribers. We could not have made this series without your ongoing and generous support. As always, if you are enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. And consider supporting our channel on Patreon. We hope to see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.